Hey friends, it's Marie at LivingFelt, and in today's video, we have our top 12 tips for wet felting over resist to create 3D shapes. If you are new to wet felting or you're ready for the next phase and you want to start felting things like vessels, hats, slippers, booties, maybe even a purse or a basket or a jacket or a skirt, but you're not quite there, these tips should help you get started. Next in our series is a dedicated video for wet felting a vessel over resist. But if you haven't done that yet, watch these tips so you keep these reminders in mind while you're working on your project. So let's start at the beginning. What is a resist? A resist is some material or object that we use in between layers of wool to keep them from felting together. A resist could be a flat piece of material, and we'll look at a few different types, or it could be a 3D object, such as a jar, a bowl, a balloon, or even one of our wet felting balls. While you can wet felt over a flat resist or a 3D resist, most of the tips that we're bringing you today really speak to wet felting over a flat resist. We will explore a few different types of resist that you can use for your project, but just keep in mind that the main goal is to prevent the wool fibers from felting together so that you can get the end shape that you want for your project. So how do you choose a material for your resist? This is the material that we're felting over, and there's a few parameters that you might think of when you're choosing that shape and the material. When we're wet felting over a flat resist, we want to think about how flexible or rigid that material is, its thickness, and we also want to think about its resistance to water. In choosing a resist material, one of the first things we mentioned was rigidity versus flexibility. You might be thinking that flexibility matters in the way we felt because very often we roll while we're felting, and you would be right, but there's more to the story. When we're felting, we take fibers from this state where they're just sort of laying together, slightly overlapping, a little more like this, and our action and activity, we're encouraging them to entangle, but not only entangle, to travel and get closer and closer together. That's what we're doing in the felting process. And we need the material that we choose for that resist inside to help us make that happen. If that material is too rigid, such as a very stiff piece of foam or a stiff piece of plastic, the fibers will not be able to move. They'll be kind of stuck in that place. So we want the material to be able to give a little bit as the fibers get closer together. That material sometimes wrinkles a little bit, and very often it will bow and bend. And you'll see that while you're continuing to shrink your project. So know that that flexibility is an important factor, and we do want some of it. To achieve this goal, the most common materials we use is a very thin foam or even a thinner foam material. It's water resistant, it's easy to cut, it's easy to draw on to get our shapes, and it has great flexibility, plus you can reuse it over and over. Another very common material is what we call our nuno bubble. It is a bubble wrap like you might use for packing, but it's very thin. The bubbles help massage the piece while you're felting it, but also it's very flexible and really permits the fibers to shrink. The finer your fibers are, the more you want that flexibility in your piece because they're going to felt very quickly. If your fibers are more coarse, you can tend to have a little more of a thick or a little more of a rigid resist, but you can also use these same ones that we're talking about now and get great results. If you're felting over a resist material and it's something other than we've mentioned, like the foam or the nuno bubble, and you find that your piece just doesn't seem like it's felting, evaluate the rigidity of that resist. When I first started felting, it was very common to suggest that we use something like a cereal box or a drink box, which is made of cardboard, but that tends to be very rigid. People also might try thick plastic foam or hard plastic like you use on a cutting board. I've even had someone bring to me corrugated plastic for a big shape, and what I found is the fibers cannot move around it. So if you're felting over resist and it seems like it's not felting down, maybe your resist is too rigid. In addition to flat resists, you can also felt over a 3D resist. You might try wet felting over a jar. You might try wet felting over a bowl or a balloon, or you might even try one of our felting balls. We have 2 size felting balls you can use for felting over, and we even have classes for those too. The thing to keep in mind is that this resist, whichever one you choose, has some rigidity. So a jar is very fixed and your piece will not be 100% felted on that one size jar. The same thing is true for a bowl. So when you start felting over these shapes, you might find it helpful to have 1 or 2 sizes down to continue the shrinking of your piece in that same shape, or just know that you're going to have to finish it off that resist. When we're felting over resist, something that's really important to keep in mind is the size of the resist in relation to the shrinkage that we're going to get from our fiber. If you're making something like a vessel that's just a decorative object, the amount of shrinkage may not be so important, but it's a good thing to start to learn to observe and plan for in your projects, because soon you're going to go from wanting to make a vessel to making wrist warmers to making slippers for your feet, or maybe even a hat for your head, and you want those items to fit. When we make a resist, we need to make it the correct size for the amount of shrinkage we're going to get from that fiber and the decorative elements that we're adding. In order to know how much shrinkage to expect, it can be really helpful to create a test piece. Now, you've probably seen a lot of times where we create a flat test piece, but even something like your vessel can be the test piece. Just know the size of your starting resist, know the amount of fiber you put in weight and number of layers, and the types of fiber you put. So if I want to make something like this as a hat, but I'm going to start as a vessel, I am going to know how much fiber I used, the number of layers I used, and I'm going to create the same types of decorative elements on this vessel that I want to have on my hat. And then I will measure the shrinkage. When you make something hollow like this, when you measure the shrinkage, you're going to compare the inside measurement of the piece compared to the size of the resist that you started with. If the piece that you make is very thin versus thick, the inside dimensions are going to be different. So we don't want to measure the outside, or if we do measure the outside, we have to subtract 2 times the thickness so that we account for the walls of that piece. Once we know our shrinkage, if we know our shrinkage will be 30% or even 40%, we know when we make our hat or a purse or slippers or whatever it is we're making, we know that we always need to make the resist at the size that will allow for that much shrinkage. Not all of it happens on the resist, but it needs to start there so that we give the fibers room to travel and get closer together so that we make a really nice, tight, and sturdy felt. So remember that not all fibers shrink the same amount. A finer fiber, you can plan for more shrinkage, but the more fiber you have on a piece, it's going to seem like you get less shrinkage. The piece gets more thick, but the more fiber in the same amount of real estate, you're going to get less dimensional shrinkage in the east-west, north-south axis. So it's important to use the same types of fiber in your test piece as you'll be using in your final project and calculate that shrinkage before moving forward. So if you want help with this whole shrinkage thing, just download the support PDF that we have with today's tutorial, and it will help you calculate the shrinkage on your project. When you're wet felting over a flat resist, you can choose to use a closed resist or an open resist. These were made over a closed resist, and that means that the resist material was completely sandwiched inside the wool. One reason for doing that can be to help really control the shape of the piece. If we had the hole in there in the first place, that hole would just get bigger and bigger as we felted. So this gives us a lot of control over the shape and allows us to cut and place our hole wherever we want once we get to that part of the felting process. An example of an open resist would be wet felting over a balloon and not covering it 100% or even the ball. Or in a flat resist, it would be if we leave one edge without any fiber on it. A reason for wet felting with one or both sides of the resist open would be to allow the fiber to travel more. When we wet felted our cowl, both ends were open because we didn't want them closed. But you can make a vessel with one end opened, and the benefit is the fiber is not being constrained by the resist and has more opportunity to travel and move felt together more quickly. If you want to wet felt something like a purse or a vessel over an open resist for the first time, you might consider tapering the resist slightly towards the top because the wool sometimes will flare out off that resist and may not be as controlled as you like. So just remember that if you're doing an open resist, a slight taper may help you control that shape just a little bit better. So we want to talk a little bit about the shape of your resist. It really should match your project, but there's a few things to think about. If you're new to felting over resist and you want to make something that has a flat or a square nature to it in any part of the design, consider rounding those corners ever so slightly because that will help prevent the resist material from poking through your fiber. Just a little rounding will really help. If you're making something that has dimension or needs a gusset, like a purse where you want to have 3 or 4 inch walled sides, a hat that needs to fit around your head, or even slippers or booties that need to go all the way around the foot, in planning of your shape, you need to allow for that gusset. Let's say you're making a vessel. If the bottom of that resist is square, your vessel is going to look pretty flat. If you want to be able to give it some girth or dimension on the bottom, just round it out and that will give you all the space you need for it to have a nice bottom to sit on. As a quick comparison, when we wet felted this bag over resist, the bottom of the resist was flat and we rounded the corners like we talked about a moment ago. But when we made these hurricane vessels, the bottom of the resist was rounded and that allows us to get this flat bottom. So experiment with your shapes and remember to mind your bottoms. Both of those are examples of simple resist, but we've also done at least one project together that was a little more complex, and that was wet felting a pumpkin. When you wet felt something that has multiple lobes, or in this case, pages, we use something that's called a book resist. Try the pumpkin project if you're ready for your next level thing, and you'll see all the complexities that go with working with such a complex resist. And if you're ready to try your own next level new design, my suggestion is to just make that resist in paper first so that you kind of get the idea of what that will be like. And as always, just start a little bit smaller before you endeavor to make something really big so you get a great test project. When we're wet felting over a flat resist, the real danger zone is the edge of that resist or shape that you're using inside. It's easy to put too little wool, too much wool, or to let the fiber slip off. So first, let's talk about too little wool. Whenever we're laying out a piece for wet felting, using your hands during the layout process to feel that everything is even and uniform is the number one key to not getting holes, thin spots, or bare spots. When we're wet felting over resist, the second part of that element is that we lay fiber out on one side and then we just wrap it around the resist to some measure so that we get a full coverage all the way around. So as you're working on a resist, make sure that you have the same coverage around the perimeter that you do in the main body of that shape. The second thing that is easy to happen is to apply too much fiber along that perimeter by piling too much bulk around the edge. So again, you're being mindful that everything is uniform and even across the sides, both sides of your resist, and that you don't allow more fiber to pile up around the perimeter than around the main body. So take care in your layout. It's the most important part of this felting process. You may have heard of the term forming a seam when we're wet felting over resist, and that is something that we don't want to happen. A seam is what's created when the fiber slips off of the resist and felts to itself. Remember, the resist is a barrier to allow us to create this hollow shape or 3D form. So you'll hear us constantly remind you to felt to the middle, to the middle, to the middle. And we're talking about allowing the agitation and action of your felting process, especially in the beginning, to start working those fibers towards the middle of your resist, as opposed to smearing or smashing it off, which might push it off the resist. So if it pushes off the resist and felt to itself, then you might felt those fibers together and create a seam, and that is not what we want. Begin always by coaxing the fibers to the middle, to the middle, to the middle, so that they start to shrink towards the center of your shape and are not getting pushed off the resist. So when to remove your piece from the resist? If you're doing a fairly controlled shape and the final shape of your piece is going to emulate what you've done over the resist, then my suggestion is felt it as far as you can on the resist until you reach a point that it's really starting to buckle or pucker or really cause the resist, which should be flexible inside, to kind of bow. When you see that bowing or it holding that rounded, that bowed shape, if you've been rolling over a pole or a bar or anything like that, then you know that the fiber is shrinking more than the resist inside. That might be a good time to start cutting your hole. What we want to do is make sure that this feels like one piece of fabric as opposed to layers of fabric. So we kind of pull and notice, does this feel like one piece of fabric, or are the design elements just pulling away? And these are holding on pretty well. We are going to release this from the resist and then continue felting it, because you're only partially done felting while it's still on the resist. If you cannot felt the inside of your vessel, like you're going to be cutting a very small hole, or if you have a lot of surface texture and dimension that you don't want to overwork once you take it off the resist, then continue felting on your resist as much as possible until you see that definitive puckering and bowing on the resist that you have inside. Now, there is a reason you might remove your resist before it's completely felted, and that is when you want to use the general shape of your resist as a starting point, but then you want to move on to actually change the shape of your object around another resist or shape. And as an example, I would say when you've felted over a flat resist and then maybe you want to change the shape and felt it over a jar. My friend Dawn did this in our Felting for Success video, and when she felted over a flat resist, she cut the hole at the top and then she put that shape over a jar and formed a shape around a jar for a completely different vessel. You might check out that video. If you're going to be changing the shape like that, you may not want to felt it as far on the flat resist. You might have cause to remove it a little sooner so that you have some room in the feltability to form it into a new shape. So we have a little tip called mark when it matters, and that is a suggestion that sometimes when we're felting over a resist, you might find that you benefit from having a little indicator mark so that you know where you are on your piece or pieces. An example might be if you're making right and left slippers and you can't quite tell the difference between them while you're working on them, but the different sides matter, then mark which one's the right or which one's the left. Maybe the inside of your piece has some fantastic design. Maybe you've even laid all of the design against the resist and you want to be careful about where you cut that hole. Then you're going to want to create some indicator mark in the layout of your process so that you know where you are in that shape. And if you can't think of any reason why this is useful, then don't worry about it. But if there comes a time that you're going to need to know, it'll make sense. And you can just use a little piece of fiber that's a different color that will be cut away or not show to help you find your way. When it's time to cut your hole, you're going to want the right pair of scissors. We suggest a very pointy, sharp pair of scissors that are about as small as you can get away with so that you can cut really clean lines. Whenever we cut or create holes in our felt, they grow. The fiber always seeks the nearest closest fiber, so any hole you create is going to get bigger. So make that hole smaller than you think you need it. You can always go back and cut it larger, but you can never make it smaller. Healing the edge is a very important step after you've cut your hole. So this is a standalone tip. Once you cut that hole, take a moment to heal that edge. Fibers that have all been laid down now have a very blunt edge. And as a rule, handmade felt does not fray, but all of those fibers are loose and able to travel. We want to heal or seal that now opened edge of cut fibers, and we do that while the piece is still on the resist, and we do it by felting it. So there's a lot of hand rubbing and work that happens at this place, and you'll appreciate it because it will help prevent those fibers from getting loose. It will make the edges look very tidy and will also help keep that hole as in the shape that you put it as much as possible. So your hole's been cut and your edge has been healed, and now it's time to actually remove the resist. And you have to pause here and evaluate how well the inside of your piece is felted. If you have a very small opening like this, it's very difficult to turn it inside out, but you can work it with your hands and felt the inside. If your piece is able to, you can turn it inside out and felt it. And if the hole is large enough, you can put your hand in there and felt all around. But you want to make sure that the inside is as well felted as the outside. Our piece is never 100% felted after we take it off the resist. We already know that. There is some shrinkage and some felting that happens after. What about after that? The final finish is so important. At the final stage, we rinse out all of the soap of our piece, and we like to do a little vinegar water bath soak to help remove the rest of the residual soap and to bring the fibers back to their natural pH. You'll notice that the wool fibers feel more smooth as all the shafts on the fiber close as a result to the vinegar affecting their pH back to their normal place. That's fantastic. But then we can really give our piece its final look by blocking it. Blocking it will be a final shaping, and I like to stuff something or stretch it over a shape and get it more into the final presentation that you want it to be, but that's not all. A steam press will give your handmade felt a beautiful finish. Do it while it's still damp and then let it dry overnight. All of the luster fibers that you put on will be at their full glory when they're dry. But really consider a nice blocking and steam pressing to give your felted piece a really glorious finish. We hope these 12 tips are helpful for you in wet felting your next 3D object over a resist. We do have some great videos in our playlist for wet felting pieces, and the next in our series is a wet felting over resist video that goes with our kit. Check out that video and the live chat that goes along with it because you'll benefit from other people's questions and ideas. If today's video brought you even more questions or ideas, we hope that you'll pop them down below so that we can help address them, and you can also post them in our Facebook group, LivingFelt Friends, along with your wet felted 3D objects so we can ooh and ah over them as well. That's it for this week, y'all, and we'll see you next time for more wet felting over resist and other fun videos. We look forward to hanging out with you then.